Hello and welcome to This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist here in North Carolina. So let's talk about some stories over the past week in the greater Triangle area of North Carolina. So first up here, we have a little hypocrisy under North Carolina law. So we have a man named Noah Najee Lorenzetti, who has been charged with the murder of a 23-year-old mother last year. And his charges have just been upgraded. He's received an additional charge of the murder of an unborn child, because under North Carolina law, if you kill an unborn child, you can be charged with their murder. Unless, of course, you are that child's mother. If you are the mother of an unborn child, you can do whatever you want to that child and not be charged for homicide, even up to the day they are born. As long as it's unborn, you're free to go under North Carolina law. So this is really sorry, I'm running into some technical difficulties. Okay, for my one viewer, sorry about that. So yes. Okay. So yeah, under North Carolina law, there is not consistent protection for the humanity of an unborn child. Only if you're a third-party murderer, then you can be charged with murder of an unborn child. If you're an abortionist under 12 weeks, you're free to do whatever. If you're the mother of the child throughout the whole pregnancy, you can do whatever you want and not be charged with the homicide of an unborn child. Now, in North Carolina, they'll say we have a 12-week ban. I don't really consider it a ban, if it's permitted before that point, and there are also exceptions. And so what we have here with the current data is about 4,000 abortions per month, the killing of 4,000 unborn children every month in the state of North Carolina. And a good chunk of that is at 4 abortion clinics in the Triangle area: Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. So, that ticks me off a little when I see hypocrisy like that in the law. Either unborn children are humans and they should be protected by the law, or they're not, and you shouldn't be charged with a homicide. It seems a pretty absurd philosophical position to me to say that they're only human if the mother wants them to live. Okay, how does that make sense? That their humanity is determined based on their parents' choice? No, either they're human and they're not. I believe they are human, and that's why I am against abortion. And I believe that abortion should be abolished, not just restricted to, a number of weeks. And our next story here is affecting a number of Triangle counties, and that is that 2 Florida men have been arrested with a string of burglaries across the state of North Carolina. Both of these men have criminal records in Florida. I think one of them may have some sort of criminal record in Iowa as well. Or is it Idaho? Either way, some Midwestern state. I'm still looking into it to put a full article about this, but basically, one of these men has been charged with breaking into 18 vehicles in a number of counties across the state, including Person, Johnson, Chatham, and Wake. So according to the Wake County Sheriff's Office, when Michael Lee Grace was in the custody of Pittsboro police, they found an item in his possession belonging to someone who had had their vehicle broken into on 1010 Road outside of Apex. So that was according to the Wake County Sheriff's Office. And I went through, I reviewed all the court documents, and it is really astonishing how much crime can be committed by one individual. But in this case, it is not just one individual, because in one of the charges against Michael Lee Grace, there are 2 conspirators charged. It is a charge of felony conspiracy, and one of those men is named Marcus Levon Felder. So both of these have their residence listed as Pompano Beach, Florida. And so Marcus Levon Felder has also been charged with 3 break-ins from October 27th, 2024, last year, in Johnson County. So the Johnson County Sheriff's Office got these warrants last December, but they were not executed until this June. So, but then he was, released out on bail. But what is pretty astonishing to me is that both these men have criminal histories in Florida for exactly the same thing: breaking into vehicles, burglary, grand theft. They come to North Carolina, and now they're charged with exactly the same thing: breaking into vehicles, stealing purses, wallets, and stealing credit cards, debit cards, using those for fraud, purchasing gift cards at places like Walmart to, be able to get that cash off of these credit cards. And so, I might be a little strict here, but if you've already served time in prison for breaking into vehicles, you get out, you break into more vehicles, you go back to prison. At what point do we just say, no, you're going to be in prison forever? If this is a pattern, if every time you're out of prison, you go commit the exact same crime, at what point are we just going to protect the people who are the victims of the crime, instead of giving these criminals, these repeat serial criminals, every chance to change their behavior when it's pretty clear they're not going to? Now, this might just be a little frustrating to me. When I was young, I left my briefcase in a vehicle in Durham, and someone broke into the window. They didn't steal my briefcase because it didn't have anything valuable in it. It was just full of school books. I was a homeschooler, but they did steal the stereo. This was in Durham, not the greatest place. But with these crimes we see, it doesn't seem like they're in bad neighborhoods. They're not just crimes of opportunity. This is someone who is maybe even making a living off of breaking into cars and stealing things. I mean, 1010 Road in Apex, I'm not too familiar with it, but from what I know, like that isn't a bad area of Wake County. This isn't like, the projects in Raleigh or something like that, where you might expect some crime to go down. And so it's not quite clear how they identified that this, serial burglar was responsible for all these break-ins. And it's not even clear what percentage, out of all the break-ins that he's committed, how many of them has he not been linked to? Who knows? One of the cases in Florida where he was charged, they were able to get his fingerprints off and identify him that way. And in that case, he had an unknown black male accomplice with him that the police said, oh, we don't know who this is. And I believe in at least a couple of these charges, there is, okay, there's an unknown person that he was or one of these people responsible for the break-ins. They've only identified one of the people, or they know there's at least one more who was involved. But yeah, just a few people can commit a ton of crime, especially when it's not when it's conspiracy. It's crime is a way of life. It's not people getting angry and committing crime. It's not a crime in the heat of passion. This is a pattern of behavior. This is a lifestyle. Personally, I'm not sure, if we're going to use prison as punishment for crime, I'm not sure why we would ever let them out of prison, because they have proven that prison does not change their behavior. So if prison does not change their behavior, should we not simply protect the public from their predations by keeping them away from the public in prison? That's my 2 cents. I think I'm a little punchy tonight. Because our next case here is another criminal, this time one that has escaped prosecution. So this is an illegal alien who is also a registered sex offender who successfully evaded a manhunt. So apparently there's a car chase down in Apex. The Apex police were trying to arrest him on new sex offense warrants. And they got their drones out there, they got their canines. They were not able to find him, so he is still on the lam. And the Department of Homeland Security is looking for him as well, because he has previously been deported. So his name is Jonathan Escobedo Ramirez, and in 2017 he was charged with second-degree forcible rape in Orange County, but he pled down to the lesser crime of sexual battery and was only sentenced to 20 days in jail, time served. So kind of sounds a bit like a slap on the wrist to me, but he was entered on the sex offender registry, and apparently he was deported, but he came back almost immediately because DHS says he has been here for about 8 years. So they are on the lookout for him. And yeah, we have his image here. If you're watching the live stream, he has some distinctive tattoos. But yeah, unfortunately, there are many, many such cases of illegal aliens who are living in Wake County, living for long periods of time. And unfortunately, Hispanics appear to be overrepresented in certain types of sexual offenses, specifically sexual offenses, statutory sex offenses with women, with girls who are, 14, 15 years old. This is a pattern we have reported on multiple cases here, both in Wake County and in some of the surrounding counties, Chatham County, Lee County. We reported previously on some stories of that nature before, but this, we've reported on a lot of arrests. This is an arrest that did not happen. This illegal alien registered sex offender was able to get away. Now for the next story here is about growth. Now, growth is perhaps the defining characteristic of the past few decades in the triangle. It's a word you hear a lot from politicians, from everyone talking about the triangle: growth, growth, growth. But when they're talking about growth, what do they mean? Do they mean the natural organic growth of parents having children, raising families, generation upon generation? No, that is not the growth in the triangle. The growth in the triangle is almost exclusively migration. This is inorganic. This is people from some other place coming here. That is the growth. And so that is, they're building new developments. Communities are changing rapidly with the influx of new people who do not share the same culture, don't necessarily share the same values, the same politics, all of that. And so when I hear politicians talking about the growth, local politicians, at least Republicans, they talk about the growth like it is inevitable, like it's perhaps the invisible hand of the market, that North Carolina is just a great place to live. And so people will come here. And so, whatever negative effects for the current population, we should just sort of grin and bear it, because it's growth that happens. People can move here or whatnot. It doesn't really matter if that growth is harming the current people of North Carolina, because you have new people who are happy to be here. And, I'm sort of seeing, and maybe I'm hallucinating, maybe I'm just wishing it to be so, But I am seeing a rising trend of people on both sides, on the right and on the left, for different reasons, that are somewhat skeptical of the growth, skeptical of how it is developing. And one instance of this is a Clayton resident who is, you know, clashed with her town council over planned development. She's, recorded and posted on TikTok about it, which is where I first came across it. But she's also had an op-ed published in the News and Observer. She's like a health equity expert, kind of coming from things from a left-wing point of view, as far as I can tell. I'm a little skeptical of the growth from more of a right-wing point of view, where basically my point of view is that the traditional values, conservative values, um, family values, they don't seem consistent with this massive level of mass migration. This is not a small amount. This is huge. This is disruptive. This is not, it's unstable. You can't have this long-term growth, long-term community building, long-term culture building together when people are being, pushed out of their communities, when the prices of housing are skyrocketing. So people face, rising tax bills, and basically they're being taxed on unrealized property gains. The only way they can realize that property gain is to move to a different community, move to a different town. And it doesn't sit right to me that the town, that your children won't be able to afford to live in the town you raised them in, just because Yankees and people from California, New York, New Jersey want to pay more for your house than you bought it for 10 years ago. That just doesn't sit right for me. It doesn't sit right for me when the people of North Carolina suffer negative effects, negative externalities, because other people who are not North Carolinians want to live here. When the cost of increasing infrastructure, the cost of building new roads, the cost of building new schools, that doesn't fall on the shoulders of the people whose migration here necessitated that new infrastructure. It falls on all of the citizens, and the traffic, whatnot, the effects of that affects everyone, when it's just a narrow section, the most recent migrants, who are benefiting from it. So when you have, the benefits and the costs are being borne by different people, that's what we call negative externalities, which, sort of doesn't really work with the free market mindset. Because if you can foist the costs while retaining the benefits, how is that fair? It just doesn't sit right with me. Once again, not from a communist point of view, not from a wealth redistribution point of view, but from a conservative view, a view where, I believe people should be able to raise their children, have long-term stability, instead of being pushed out, due to these economic pressures. And that's not even getting into the Democratic vote dilution, obviously small d Democratic, which is that, let's say you have a town of 10,000 people. If 10,000 new people move into your town, well, now your vote is only worth half as much. Now someone who just came has as much democratic power to choose your leaders, to set your town in a whole different direction politically, than you have with your one vote as someone who has lived there your entire life. And so that doesn't just affect your town, your county, that affects the whole state. When, we're electing statewide offices, at this point, less than half of the adults in North Carolina were born here. That is a massive change. And to address the point of whether this is inevitable, the way I see it, there are a number of decisions at the private level, at the local level, the county level, the state level, the federal level, that influence this mass migration. And that is things like the Greater Raleigh Chamber of Commerce has been running ads advertising people to move to the Triangle. And they're running these ads in blue-leaning metropolitan areas. This was a story, I believe it was covered in WREL. You have economic growth incentives by our state government to create jobs. And the question I ask is, are those jobs going to natives of North Carolina? Are they going to people who are already here? Or are they just acting as a magnet to attract new people? What interests does the state government have in spending our taxes to attract new people here? That's what I would ask. And finally, on the federal level, immigration, foreign immigration, international immigration, I believe has a huge effect on both international migration to North Carolina as well as domestic migration. So that the three states that have the most net migration to North Carolina, New York, Florida, and California, are also three of the 4 states where over 20% of the population is foreign born. I do not believe this is a coincidence. I believe these massive numbers of immigration, 1 out of 5 people in these states is foreign born, was not born in America. What sort of economic pressure is that creating in those states that is driving people to move to North Carolina? I believe that is the case. So I don't believe that this level of mass migration is inevitable, and I don't believe that there is nothing that politicians can do at levels of government to, ameliorate the negative externalities that are being foisted on the people of North Carolina. But once again, that's my 2 cents. That's my aside. So currently, as a journalist, I don't do as much opinion writing, but I am working on compiling some data using the census data, using the vital statistics, using the voter registration to kind of help people get their mind around, have a better grasp on just how fast those changes are happening in the Triangle area and how that is influencing the demographics, the politics, who is a citizen here in the Triangle, and how our communities are changing, how our cities are changing. And so I'm hoping to have some of that data out in the not too distant future. And our last story here, once again in Raleigh. Unfortunately, I cover a lot of stories in Raleigh because that is sort of the center of the population. Wake County has a huge population. Just about nearly half the population of the Triangle is in Wake County. And a decent chunk of that is in Raleigh specifically. But yeah, a story out of Raleigh, and this is not just about crime, but about media narratives. So a transgender identifying man, that is how I refer to it. Sorry, not it, him. The mainstream media will refer to this man as a woman because he identifies as a woman. I refer to him as a man because that is what he is. So a transgender identifying man makes this post on Instagram saying, I was assaulted, me and my friend, also transgender identifying man, were sexually assaulted at an LGBTQ nightclub legend. And so he makes this video talking about how he and this other person, are brown and trans and black and trans and all this intersectional language, complaining that the staff and the other patrons didn't step in to help these trans people of color. These trans person of color, this woke language, this intersectional language. But I believe this was gaslighting. Why was this gaslighting? Well, because he brought up his own race. He brought up the race of the other individual who was the victim of this assault, purportedly. But he failed to mention the race of the attacker. Now, if you know some data on, anti-trans crime, these hate crimes, it appears from the data that, black men are overrepresented in crimes against trans people, just like they are in most violent crimes. But that's a whole nother story. But if you are bringing up your race as this intersectional victimhood, that you have been the victim of an attack, but then you neglect to mention the race of the attacker, either it's relevant for the victim and it's relevant for the attacker, or it's not relevant for other. You can't pick and choose. You can't imply that your status as a person of color has something to do with you being a victim, but then ignore that the attacker was also of the same race. So, the News and Observer ran with this, same kind of intersectional angle about marginalized communities and hate crimes and whatever. But the Raleigh police did make arrests in this assault. So they charged Darren Ermont Corbett of Wake County, of Jacksonville, with sexual battery and simple affray. So he is a black man. But they also charged this transgender identifying man who, dresses as a woman. They charged him with simple affray as well. So simple affray is basically, it's kind of like mutual assault. So it's two people fighting. They're both charged with simple affray. Now, the Raleigh police didn't seem to make clear why both of them were charged, because if one of them, if the man is charged with sexual battery, that kind of lines up with the story that this fight, this violence, this use of force was because of the sexual battery. So if the Raleigh police is acknowledging that this sexual battery happened, or sexual assault as it would be more commonly termed, why did they charge this other person for fighting with the person committing sexual battery? I don't know. They didn't explain that. Because narrative aside, self-defense laws should apply to everyone. And so in North Carolina, there is law around using self-defense, and the law reads: a person is justified in using force except deadly force against another when and to the extent that the person reasonably believes that the conduct is necessary to defend himself or herself or another against the other's imminent use of unlawful force. However, a person is justified in the use of deadly force and does not have a duty to blah, 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 blah. But basically, you can use non-deadly force to prevent an imminent use of unlawful force against yourself or someone else. So, some of the exact facts, but besides the story put out by one of the parties who has now been charged with simple affray, I guess we don't know the exact details. Maybe what happened is that after the sexual battery, occurred and was over, and there's no imminent threat of it in the future, maybe that's when the Raleigh police would argue in court that there is no imminent threat, because that is a criteria for self-defense. And so this man who says he was sexually assaulted, they have raised over $10,000 via a fundraiser. And so our final story for this broadcast is an update on a gentleman we have previously covered, named James Jamie Marsicano. So he is also transgender identifying, but he is Antifa. And so he is charged with domestic terrorism and RICO conspiracy for a black bloc attack on the Cop City law enforcement facility in Georgia in 2023. So basically, these Antifa and black bloc showed up. I believe they were throwing bricks, rocks, etc., maybe throwing some Molotov cocktails, but the law enforcement came hard against them and ended up charging a number of them with both domestic terrorism and RICO. So these conspiracy charges. But recently, I believe it was the week before, not this week, but I didn't see it until this week, is that the judge dropped the domestic terrorism charges against Marsicano, but the RICO conspiracy charges still remain. This was more of a procedural thing, that the government was improperly prosecuting these charges in some way, that the judge ruled that it would be dismissed. So if this happened in Georgia, what relevance does this have to North Carolina and the Triangle specifically? Well, we have previously reported on Marsicano as he was a student at UNC Law, and there was at least one protest held because he was banned from the UNC Chapel Hill campus over these domestic terrorism charges. If you've been charged with domestic terrorism, you can't just keep going to school at UNC. But you can keep going to school at Duke, which is where he finished up his UNC law degree. There's a protest over the fact that he wasn't allowed to, participate in the graduation ceremony. And so that was, just a sort of follow-up story. He also received some sort of award at UNC. So he was the recipient of the 2024 Winston Crisp Leadership Award, presented by the UNC Student Bar Association. So apparently, being Antifa, being an alleged terrorist, allegedly participating in terroristic acts, will get you an award at UNC. So for everyone who is tuned in, whether you're listening to this live or listening to the recording, thanks for being here. You can find the newsletter in text form at triangletrumpet.news. If you sign up, you get it a little earlier in your inbox, where there's links, pictures, data, everything I've been referring to with these stories. So that's triangletrumpet.news. Thanks for being here.